Hi, my name is Ian, and today we're going to talk about how I structure or plot a story. I know. There is so much advice out there on the internet and in books and in blogs and podcasts and possibly even seminars at writing conferences about this very subject. The formulas and manuals for plotting and writing are all basically out there already, and still, everyone has their advice. Everyone does something just a little bit differently. I can't think of a time when an author visited my university when I was going to school, and when they were given a Q&A time during their seminar, and someone in the audience of adults always asked, "But how do you do it? What's your secret?" So today I'm going to share with you what my current method and routine is for plotting a story. Hold on. There really is no secret to creating a plot or figuring out how to work your novel. Everyone has their own method of what works best for them, and generally, my impression is that we all create our versions of plotting based on the variations we've read about or learned about over the years, and then tweaking it a little bit for the amount of pantser or plotter we have inside of us. But as a quick aside, before we get into this, in case you're unfamiliar with writing lingo, a pantser is somebody who typically writes by the seat of their pants, as it were. They don't necessarily plot a lot. Sometimes they don't plot at all. And they write without plot points necessarily, or characters, or direction. They kind of just go with whatever comes to mind at the time. For example, think of somebody who's going on vacation and they know where their destination is, their starting point. Maybe they're flying to DC, maybe they're going to France. They know where they're going to land, but they'll figure out what they're going to do when they're there while they're there. Meanwhile, a plotter is on the opposite side of the spectrum. The plotter is somebody who will plot out every important item. If we consider plotting and pantsing as a spectrum, and the person on the farthest end of the pantsing spectrum will just make up everything as they go along in the spur of the moment, the furthest end of the plotter is somebody who will figure out everything, every detail of their story before they get started. So they'll figure out every character, every location, every plot point, every monster, if there's some kind of fantasy or horror aspect to it where they have to create those kinds of things. They'll figure out every plot point or twist, every dynamic action or decision, and when it happens. And if they're doing a book series, they'll figure out a majority of the book series. I actually used to go to in my undergraduate program, I met a gentleman who was plotting a huge novel series, and he had all of the novels plotted out. He just hadn't written them yet, and it was very detailed plotting. He was a very anal retentive kind of guy. So back to the vacation, where the one vacationer gets to the location and figures out what he wants to do as he's walking around. The plotter vacationer will not only know where they're starting, but they'll have an itinerary for what they're doing every day, the times they're going to be there, probably the things they're going to have for lunch, where they want to try for lunch, when they go back, they're going to have everything worked out down to the smallest excursion. And of course, since pantsers and plotters are on a spectrum, you don't have to go full random, just like you don't have to do 85 character quizzes to find out everyone's favorite food down to that one guy who's in a scene for half a page and then never seen again. Personally, I fall more on the side of the pantser, and I tend to do a lot of plot. I tend to discover a lot of plot elements as I actually write, and what I tend to plot often changes once I'm in the fray of discovering who my characters really are, what they want, how they act, and the kind of situation that they're stuck in or that they've created for themselves. Before we get started on how I plot a story, we have to answer the question, what comes first, the character or the plot? This is different for every person, and neither is more correct than the other. Just like a pantser or plotter, character or plot first depends on how a person's creativity works and what has inspired them. For me, generally the character comes first and then the plot follows. However, I have to admit that the idea for my first novel came from setting and plot well before the characters, because the plot was completely inspired by something else. It was basically an adaptation of a board game into a novel, and I changed it heavily in some places. Everything else is usually character first for me. I come up with an idea for a character, which might just be a sentence, it might just be an idea of a character type, and then it builds off from there. As an example, my second novel features the character Dimitri, and he's a cannibal. He is insane in a psychopathic way. He's charming, presentable, and sees nothing wrong with what he's doing. He sees himself apart from humanity, and all of that came first. I had a feeling that I wanted to make a cannibal, and I wanted to make a charming cannibal, and that's all that I had. And once I started developing him, once I started hearing his voice, then his personality started to come. So once he started to come into picture, the setting that he was stuck in started to come into mind, and that was a mental ward. And after the mental ward started to form, I got inspired for another character in the series, who is Caleb, a 10-year-old child who is kind of mental. He has autism, and he has a hard time communicating. And it's been a couple of years since the setting has fully developed. When I initially made Caleb and Dimitri, it was 2011 in a playwriting class. The show they were in was still set in a mental ward, and their new story is also in a mental ward, but it's completely different. The original story they were in was more modern day, and the current one is actually in 1954. The whole show that they were originally placed in has been trashed, and the story doesn't even necessarily revolve around Dimitri or Caleb, but they're central members of it. Other examples for character ideas that have come in order to create the plot later include, I wanted to make a psychic named Pilot. That was it. That was all the inspiration I needed was, I like the name Pilot. Oh, psychic. And I was watching a show that was I was watching the pilot episode of a show about psychics. When I got that one, I was like, I want it. So sometimes it's really obvious what caused, it's a very literal translation where the inspiration comes from. I wanted to make a magician as we know them, no actual magic, and he uses the sleight of hand to steal. I wanted to use the name Marlowe. Sometimes that's all it is. I hear a name and I go, I want that. There's a character in there for me. I wanted to use the name Seymour. I want to make someone who can read minds. I want to make somebody who's blind. I want to make a woman out of paper. I want to make somebody with 2 different colored eyes. Back in 2014, when the Evil Within video game came out, I was so inspired by the setting and the warping and the monstery feel of it that I was like, ooh, I want to do something creepy. I want to do something with monsters where I can get kind of just psychedelic with it. And I want to make somebody who's having some mental problems and getting lost inside of themselves. And now I have a character who, after his parents died, he can now be possessed by ghosts. And he's slowly losing track of who he is by absorbing their memories every time he gets taken over by them. He also doesn't know that he's being taken over by ghosts. He just has blackout moments and he thinks that he is psychotic. Because everyone else around him goes, why are you acting like this? This isn't like you. And he just thinks that the accident has left him very damaged. So from the list that I just gave you, aside from the woman made of paper, each of these characters' ideas actually now have names and their stories have been developing. Some of them have their stories more created than others. Others are just sitting kind of in the queues. The blind guy has actually just recently developed a new part to his, a new element to his story or his identity, which I really like. I think it's really fitting, but I'm not going to share it yet because that story is not very far along. That development of that universe isn't very far along. I've had that character for a couple of years now, though. At least 3. At least 3. I think he first showed up in 2016. So what I just listed are some really generic character traits or a plain name. There's nothing necessarily special about any of them other than they tickled my fancy or imagination. One of them, one of them was just a pilot episode for a psychic television show. But what they all have in common is their stories started with a character, with an urge to make a character with a name that brought me a voice. And then that character started to get a setting because they came to me with their voice, who they were, and the setting builds around a character as you start to feel them out. With the Mental Institute and the stuff that I wanted to cover in the Mental Institute story, there's a lot that you actually can't do nowadays because mental institutes and hospitals are way different than they were 50, 60 years ago. So that's something to take into consideration where the setting follows the character and what helps inform how the character develops. When I start a story, I don't usually know who they fully are, what their voice fully is, and everything about them. But what I do know is what they currently want, what's standing in their way, and what they're willing to do to go for it in the immediateness. We're not talking about like the maximum climax in some cases. We're talking about what is important today. So once you have a character, you've got your inkling, you've got your voice, how do you build a plot? Especially when you only have one character, maybe. Obviously, my Mental Ward 1 started out with Dimitri and Caleb. Neither of them were central characters, though. Or neither of them were the main character. This is where my plotting comes in. I have my main character, I have maybe one or two central characters, because your main character can't do it alone. And so this is where I get out of pantsing. Like I said, I just have vague ideas, and then I turn the car on and drive. When plotting, I go pretty traditional with the 3-act structure, but if I needed to, I could break it down into more or less acts. This is more like writing plays or screenplays than novels, as far as I know, but it can still be used for novel writing. I use the split of the 3 acts to mean 3 major climaxes that change something for the character, or change the stakes, or change the setting. The climax in the last act, in this case in the 3rd act, is also the climax of the novel. However, it's not the only climax of the story. As someone who studied theater, acting, and writing, in my case, I take more of a theatrical approach to scenes and story design. Just bear with me on this as I try to break it down the best way that I can, how I imagine it. If you look at a generic graph of action of a storyline, you'll see the inciting incident kind of near the beginning. You'll have your little uptick of action, and then the inciting incident, which changes the status quo, changes the life of the main character, and then shoots them into kind of a leap and valley kind of thing that builds them closer to the ultimate book climax. A character can't just walk out of their house and then be at, Mount Doom. Every one of those little peaks and valleys in the earlier lineup helps to create the situation in which your character can get to Mount Doom. Choices, situations, people they meet, all of it are vehicles to the climactic moment. Things that there's no way around it. Things have to happen to get them there. Sometimes your character even has to, most of the time, characters even have to be pushed to the emotional edge and forced into a situation that they don't want to be in order to make that decision. And this is where the 3-act structure has helped me a lot. By slicing the story into 3 major sections, I've created a major moment in each of them that it becomes a turning point for the main character. For example, I'm going to use my first novel for the structure. And maybe someday people will get to read it and then be able to go, oh, okay, I see exactly what you are aligning to, hoping, praying. So anyway, Dead End Drive, my first novel, is inspired by Agatha Christie kind of mystery with a dark comedy edge and a battle royale feature where you win the mansion if you're the last one to survive. Fortunately, when dealing with something like mystery or novels with death in them, those deaths can be climactic moments, especially depending on how many climactic deaths or how many deaths you have in the story. In order to change the status quo of everyone's regular life, the owner of the house has to die, all of the servants that are interested in participating have to come together, and the game has to start. In this case, in my novel, the will reading after the passing of the heiress is the thing that sets off the murdering spree, and the stakes change. The 1st act climax is then when the first character dies, because the status quo has changed. The inciting incident is the letters going out saying, hey, we're gathering for the will reading, because that already changes everybody's lives. And then finally, the will reading is the climax, or the death during the will reading is the climax. Now, the game of murder is afoot. There are a dozen people vying for the money, and they're all trapped in the same house. So then we get into Act 2, where there's a bunch of murder and mayhem. The climax of Act 2, then, is when the main character escapes certain death. For all of this time, he's been naive, childish, innocent, and he's not there to murder for money. He was there because he was required to, and he didn't know what would happen. So at this point, after being chased by 2 or 3 different people, and also witnessing a very brutal murder, he realizes how serious the stakes are and how dangerous the people are. So things have just gotten more dangerous. Then finally with Act 3, we go into Act 3 where, we kill the remaining higher of importance characters, and the climax of the book would result in the final kill and the money being given out during the denouement. Now, I've got my 3 major acts and my 3 major plot points. The thing is, the characters can't just enter Act 1 and immediately get to the climax of somebody dying at the will reading. If the will reading and ultimately the first death are my goal, then I must assemble every character who will be at the will reading in the game. I must prepare the house, I must get them all to the correct room in the will, and I must determine the means of the murder. Each one of these will have a focus in the chapter if they're important, and the character will introduce themselves, move around, create a setting, and each chapter will have its own sort of mini climax that's brought about from the goal of the character or the need of the character. In theater, as an actor, we're trained that no one walks on stage without having an objective. They come from doing something and they're moving to do something else, be it to fix boredom or to open the door or look for snacks or murder somebody. Same should be said with each character in your novel, in your chapter, in your scene. What is it that he is doing there? Where is he trying to go? What is he trying to accomplish? And with this, you create beats, just like little moments in your story. The small decisions that a character will make in the scene are necessary in order to get them to their bigger objective. And once all of those things have been accomplished, I basically unlock the chapter that has the climax for the act. I then move on to the next chapter and the next act, and I consider what all things I need to do in order to unlock the Act 2 climax. What needs to happen, and I build my outline of chapters for the small things that need to happen in order to unlock that, and then I work my way up there, and then into Act 3 I do the same thing, what all needs to happen to get me to the major climax. And that's usually all that I go with. An easy explanation of what my outline would actually look like after doing all that would be Chapter 3, Character A dies. Chapter 4, Character B dies. Chapter 5, Place a bet. Chapter 6, Character C dies. Sometimes I can't even think of what needs to be in a scene, but I know that there's some tension that's not quite there yet. And if I know that there's tension that's like a missing element, something's not built in yet, but something is missing, I'll put an empty scene there, and I'll just write past it. And once I've discovered more of the story, I'll come back to it. This has helped me a lot. I think the last chapter that I finished in my first book was probably around chapter 10. I just recently rechaptered that book, so I don't really remember. But it was like 80 pages into the story before that was the last chapter that I finished. And I had to get to the end of the book before I could go back and redo it, and I've rewritten that scene like 7 or 8 times. That said, my second novel outline looked a little bit more filled out the first time I started writing it, and then once I went back to fix it for the first edit, it changed a lot, especially in the middle and at the end. And while I was writing my second novel, I actually skipped writing 2 chapters because I had no idea what needed to go inside of them. I just knew something was missing. So I jumped past those and then wrote the sections that I already knew what needed to happen. And once I finished and I got around to them in my second round with the book, I knew what needed to go there because I'd known these characters more. I'd known information that needed to be set up for later on. I'd had a lot more time to discover what was necessary. Every so often, if I had a thought for a chapter, I would go into the section for that chapter and I would just write down the thought. It'd just be a sentence, maybe 2 sentences to remind me to, hey, say this in this chapter or introduce this in this chapter for when I actually got to write that chapter. But for the most part, this is what guided me, and it was just a reference for what I needed to do in that chapter. Obviously, there's a lot of still discovering for me to do in all of this stuff. This is all that I needed to do in order to give myself direction for how to go. And you might want to do more. One of my good friends plots things out like J.K. Rowling does. She has huge wall, all of this combing, doing little blocks, and she's saying what each character is doing in the scene that they're in there or what they want, what their accomplishments are for every single scene before she starts writing it. That's not me. It's similar to what I do, but it's a lot more detailed. She's also writing an epic fantasy, so depending on the type of novel that you're doing, or if you're doing a series versus a singular, which I typically work in singles, then you might require more plotting so that you can weave elements together. So this was just a rundown of how I personally plot stories, and as you can guess, it only kind of vaguely resembles what I've started after I get to the end. That said, don't get hung up on stuff not being good or exactly how you imagined the first time you're writing it. Even with all the plotting, there's some level of discovery that takes place when you put pen to paper or fingers to keys and start discovering the world alongside the characters that you've put in it. Being surprised is good, because in your writing, if you can't surprise yourself, how do you think you're ever going to surprise your readers?